Shall we get going? Sound people, are we ready to go? Is Alan, our virtual panelist with us? Hello, Alan. Hello, Alan. Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us this morning. My name is Anton Harbour from the Campaign for Free Expression. We have an excellent panel this morning. The starting point is the report that we're releasing today on the state of free expression in South Africa, 2024. It's our second annual report on the situation. And this one is titled A Need for Vigilance, which I think sums up part of the core message. I'm going to ask Alan Finley, who's here virtually, who compiled the report, to give us an introduction to it. Is his presentation going to be projected over there? Okay, and we'll see it here, I hope. So he'll give us an introduction to the report. I will then move on to our panelists to ask them to highlight any issues, raise any issues, add to it any thoughts they have on the current situation. We have Ismail Mohammed, well known from the world of arts and culture, and a member of the board of CFE. So I'm sure he'll speak about that aspect of it. With me, many of you will know Daria Milo, attorney, media attorney, very well known for his work in this area of free expression and media freedom. Patusa Magopeni, broadcaster, former head of news at SABC. In other words, she's a recovering SABC head of news. We work together at ENCA as well, so we go back a bit. It's great to see a number of old friends here and hopefully some new friends that we will meet. So thank you very much for taking the time to be with us. I'll tell you in 2 sentences about Campaign for Free Expression. We're quite a new young organization that's operating now in 5 countries across Southern Africa, a footprint we hope to enlarge. And the name of our organization says exactly what we do: defend and build free expression across these countries. One of the things we do is we do a report on each of those 5 countries. Botswana, Malawi, Zimbabwe, Eswatini, and South Africa. So the first thing we do to give us a factual base for our work, a research base, is a close look at the state of free expression in each of those countries. And it's extremely interesting because each of them have their own particular situations but share a lot in common. So it's quite useful to look at them together. All of, in your packs today, you should get the South African one, and the others are all available online on our site if you wish to find them. So I'm going to hand over to Alan. Alan is a researcher of some experience and note, and he played the key role in compiling this report. Alan.
Thanks, Anton. On a technical issue, I should share the presentation, right? Through my share screen options.
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, I'm going to do that. I'm getting steady, just do this quickly. There we go. Can you see that fine? Is my presentation showing?
Yes, it is.
Okay, thanks. So I've got about 5 minutes just to go through some of the top level findings of the report, and thanks for the introduction, Anton. So to say the time frame was a year, so our previous report was for 5 years. This was from September last year until the end of August this year. And series with threats to media freedom, the elections, targeted killings, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, protests, and legislative and policy developments. Um, this relies on reported incidents, so we respond to what's reported, media statements by rights organizations, research reports, databases such as the one kept by the Institute for Security Studies. But this issue also includes an analysis of media coverage that we did of protest action by ground up. The report shows that a number of the threats to freedom of expression that were identified in our previous report have carried over into this year, which is not entirely unexpected, but it's interesting to note that these trends continue. And for instance, when we come to top-level findings, trends in threats that prevent journalists reporting freely without item assignment, as in the field, have continued. The attacks are mostly by the police, the public and political parties. In this last year, the gendered nature of many of these attacks on journalists have been noted. And with respect to that, this is something that we've known in the past, particularly online, but what's been highlighted now more is by organizations like SANEF, or SANEF in particular, is attacks on female journalists when going out into the field, which raises questions about the future of women in journalism in this country. Notably, one of the incidents involved the MK party, who have in the past also, recently in the past, but also the supporters of Zuma, shown the ill treatment of journalists. So the MK party, together with the EFF, need to be watched, in particular in terms of their attitudes to journalists and media freedom. New draft legislation extending the surveillance capabilities of the State Security Agency, and we're talking about GLAB here, which all of you will know about. And just to say, there have been some positive developments, such as the criminal defamation being repealed in the new Judicial Matters Amendment Act, and the law has historically been used to restrict free speech and silence journalists. During this period, the independence of the public broadcaster came under question. There were three issues here. One was the SABC bill, which, amongst other things, plans to give overall editorial responsibility to the CEO, which we've seen previously at the SABC. We saw state security vetting the head of news at the SABC during elections. He was also asked to take a polygraph test, which he refused. And the polygraph has been described by the government in the past as a mechanism to test loyalty to the state. And the SABC also refused to air an advert by the Democratic Alliance during the elections, and that was the flag-burning advertisement. Politically motivated assassinations. This is a very strange thing we've got used to in South Africa. There was one assassination on average every 2 weeks in the run-up to the elections, which is quite startling, really. And this, combined with the violent protests that disrupted electoral processes in communities, meant that many South Africans are likely to have voted in the context of intimidation and fear. This is in the context of declaring the elections free and fair, but we always need to obviously bear in mind these assassinations and the community violence that occurs. Online attacks on journalists during the elections were considered a greater threat to media freedoms than incidents in the field, although there was one important one at an MK rally that happened where journalists were harassed and assaulted. And notably here, there was little help from the big technology platforms, when SANEF approached them to deal with this potential threat of online attacks before the elections.
Alan, do you want to move to the next? Alan, do you want to move to the next slide? Yeah, thank you.
Sorry about that. Yeah, sorry, I didn't notice my marking text. Public protests. There were 703 public protests recorded across the country during the period, the one-year period, or nearly 2 a day. So clearly it remains a vital form of free expression in South Africa. Some of them, of course, turned violent, and I was actually surprised to read in one report we analyzed that the protesters were armed. So the police obviously have a difficult job in many circumstances. However, our analysis suggests that that when police do intervene in protests, there remains a reasonable chance that the rights of protesters and bystanders will be infringed. In our analysis of articles, which was 91 articles, 91 reports of protests done by ground up, police intervened. But in more than half of those, so it was 5 or more, the intervention was said to be disproportionate by the protesters or the community. And these interventions are violent too. A lot of people got rubber bullets, stun grenades, arrests, and so on. The numerous forms of pro-Palestinian solidarity protests in this country have been have gone ahead peacefully, and this is in marked contrast, as we know, to the what's happening in many developed countries in terms of free expression and pro-Palestinian positions. However, in this country, there were also a couple of incidents that need to be questioned in terms of freedom of expression, including one that many of us know about, involving the under-19 cricket captain. The SABC's Metro FM cancelling an interview with the Jewish survivor of the October 7th attacks by Hamas in Israel, and one involving a coloring book at Exclusive Books that was supportive of the Palestinians in Gaza that was apparently taken off the shelves by Exclusive Books. Slap legislation, this we recorded in the previous year, and it again has happened in this period, the previous period, 5-year period, and again in this period. It shows the ongoing use of the courts by some businesses to try silence reporting and other forms of public exposure, and both the incidents that we record here involve foreign companies. And lastly, we also touch on media sustainability, which has been described as dysfunctional, the media environment, largely due to the harvesting of advertising revenue by big tech. And here one example was Media 24 saying that Google takes 95% generated by news content at News 24. And of course, what this does is threaten the capacity of the media to report in the public interest, and therefore has implications for freedom of expression. So as you'll see, we've tried to cover quite a range of issues, and there are many cross-cutting issues. We've been discussing expanding on and discussing these issues we identify: environmental activism, art and culture funding, gender, information, disinformation, and so on. Thanks, Anton. Quite high level, but that's a summary.
Thank you very much. Everyone has a copy, and there's digital copies available on our website, so they can catch up on the detail. But thank you, Alan, for a report. I think you've given a sense of how much ground has to be covered, and it illustrates just how necessary it is to be watching all of these areas as they impinge on issues of free expression. Ismail, I'm going to ask you to jump in and ask for your thoughts on the sphere you work in.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much. The only reason I'm sitting away from you is because I have a cold. So just a note for the technicians, you've got to sanitize this mic before you hand it over to the next person. Thank you very much for the report by Alan. It's an extensive report, but I'm going to talk specifically around the chapter that he has on arts and culture. And then I'll address the question of media that writes about the arts. In 1996, when the white paper on arts and culture was adopted through a broad-based public consultation basis with the cultural and creative industries, that signaled an element of hope because it would indicate the way arm's-length funding of the arts would be directed and how arts organizations would be governed. But that was not a hope that lasted very, very long, because soon after that, the act was amended in 2003, the Cultural Institutions Amendment Act, which where previously the public had the right to nominate members of a council for a cultural institution, and the council itself that would be publicly interviewed, the members of the council would be publicly interviewed. That stopped happening, and the chairpersons of the councils were no longer appointed by the members of the council themselves, but were appointed by the minister. And that was a serious level of interference, because it no longer left control and governance of the organizations in the hands of the council, and the operations in the hands of management. It simply meant that the Minister of Art and Culture would have a more direct influence over the council because he appoints the chairperson, he directs that, what happens. But also that apart from the council chairperson reporting directly to the minister, the business plans of the institutions also needed to be approved by the minister. And where institutions previously were considered in terms of the original white paper on arts and culture as institutions of the public, all the institutions that are now governed by the Act, which includes the Market Theatre, which has a history of free expression, all have to carry at the entrance an agency of the state. And that becomes incredibly problematic because it reflects the kind of changed philosophy in terms of how those organizations operate and how the kind of content that gets presented in those particular institutions, but also who gets appointed to those particular institutions. I just want to get through a few points here. And then in 2008, President Jacob Zuma convened a meeting at the Johannesburg Convention Center, and he mooted for the formation of a single federation that would govern the arts, and that all members who work in the cultural and creative industries needed to be registered members of the federation, and that the federation would work very, very closely with the DAC to determine funding policy, who gets funded, who doesn't get funded, and so forth. The organization CIFSA, which is short for Cultural and Creative Industries Federation, is literally a violation of the South African Constitution around freedom of association. Because freedom of association means that you have the right to join any organization, but you also have the right not to be a member of an organization. So to prescribe for all artists that you have to be members of the organization in order to engage with the Department of Arts and Culture and in order to be able to receive funding is incredibly problematic, and that has not been challenged by any rights-based organization. CIFSA now in its website since the beginning of this year has added a clause to say that it is an independent organization in terms of the Companies Act. However, in its historical statement and its mission statement, it does state very clearly that it was established by the DAC, it continues to be funded by the DAC, and its original members' interim committee was appointed by the DAC as well. In 2010, with Minister Lulu Tsigwana, we saw an increase in censorship of artists, and one particular case that stands out is the exhibition about lesbian women, a photographic exhibition that was in the Concord. 2012, the Brett Murray spear controversy, and an increased grip around satirical work in South Africa. As a result, we also saw that all state institutions began to soften the kind of exhibitions that are presented at public-funded institutions, but at independent, funding-dependent organizations. And I'm talking about organizations that are not state organizations. There was also a softening of content, largely because of fear that if you present work that challenges the state, you're not going to get any kind of funding. During the tenure of Nathi Mthethwa, and with Vusi Mkhize appointed as the Director General for the Department of Arts and Culture, we saw a greater interference in the freedom of exercise around art and culture. We saw high levels of funding patronage, and we saw blacklists reaching its peak. And among some of that was the blacklisting of Charles Blichnout, who was a City Press editor, arts journalist, from being blacklisted by the Department of Arts and Culture for his critical exposés of dysfunctionality within state institutions. We saw defamation of character by Nathi Mthethwa, of Mike van der Graan, a renowned playwright and arts critic, where Nathi Mthethwa issued a statement on his Facebook page stating that the only reason Mike van der Graan was bitter is because he requested the minister to become his advisor, and the minister did not offer that. Mike van der Graan challenged the minister to provide evidence of that, and to date, the DAC or the minister, Natim Tetwa, or any subsequent minister, has not provided any kind of evidence like that. So that kind of defamation of character of arts people who spoke out against the DAC was on the increase. We saw an increased number of forensic audits at institutions where either artistic directors or CEOs or board members of those councils began to challenge the DAC. In most cases, those forensic audits were failed audits. They could not go any further. In 2017, when I was the CEO of the Market Theatre, together with the CFO, Christine MacDonald, we invoked the Protectors Disclosures Act, and we whistle blew on the Market Theatre Council, who were dipping their hands into the coffers to pay themselves rates which were in contradiction of the Treasury regulations. Despite bringing close to about 2,000 pages of evidence to the DAC and to Natim Tetwa, they did nothing about it until we had to whistleblow, and a case that took almost 3 years to sort itself out in one, which we won with every charge of theirs falling flat on its face. We've also seen the dismissal of dancer and choreographer Mamela Nyamsa, a renowned South African choreographer and dancer, who was dismissed as the artistic director of the State Theatre by the council for outspoken criticism of the Artscape Theatre, which is an institution of the state as well. But just recently, we've seen also artist complicity in censorship. A notable case is this year when the artistic director of the Baxter Theatre, Lara Foot, tried to silence criticism of her work, Othello, which she said deals with issues of decoloniality. She invited an audience to engage with it, and when Mike van der Graan did engage with it, she shut him down, closed discussion, and blocked him from the theatre's Facebook page. And that is quite ironical, because the Baxter Theatre is not an institution of the state like the Market Theatre, the State Theatre, Artscape, or whatever. It's a theatre that is on a university campus, funded by a university campus, and it becomes incredibly worrisome when a university-based theatre shuts down debate and discussion. Just last week, we've seen the Good Book Appreciation Society shutting down and then blocking acclaimed novelist Joanne Joseph. In July this year, we've seen the Film and Publications Board put a classification of 18 plus on the latest film about Zapiro Showerhead, an acclaimed little film that was premiered at the Durban International Film Festival. Now that is incredibly worrisome when a film like that gets an 18 plus classification. One would expect that an audience 16 to 18 needs to receive exposure to political information, because to ready them for being able to vote. The book, Alan spoke about the book that was pulled off the shelves from exclusive books, River to Sea. There have been numerous cases. I can go through about 50 cases of censorship in South Africa since the Cultural Amendment Laws Act was promulgated. We've also seen, for the last 3 years, a failure to adopt the new revised white paper on arts and culture, which has been sitting at the DAC for at least 4 years collecting dust. Now, what is incredibly worrisome for us as an arts and culture department, I spoke earlier about that a lot of the censorship came about when Vusi Mkhize was the Director General to the Department of Arts and Culture. Vusi Mkhize is presently the CEO of the South African Human Rights Commission. Now, when one considers that the PSP debacle that Alan writes about in this report, the protests by artists, the sit-in at the National Arts Council, all happened under the watch of Vusi Mkhize when he was Director General. What hope is there for the arts sector that the Commission itself would stand up to defend the arts when it's necessary to do so? What is even more worrisome is that the National Arts Festival which for more than 40 years held an open fringe for artists. When I talk about an open fringe, it's any artist could register to present work at the National Arts Festival, provided you pay for the venue and your basic registration fee to be included in the promotional content and collateral of the festival. The festival, due to funding constraints, no longer presents an open fringe. It presents a selected fringe, which means artists have to apply, a committee selects the productions, which now means that there is no open fringe for any artist in South Africa. But just a fortnight ago, there was a worrisome response from the Department of Arts and Culture at the Parliamentary Portfolio Committee on Arts and Culture when they were asked a question around their performance rate around internationalization of the arts. We know that a large number of South African artists are making it incredibly well on the international stages, but they don't do that with the support of the Department of Arts and Culture or any other state funding institution. Artists like Reggie Makoma, Dada Masilo, Brett Bailey find money through corporate sector or through other fundraising efforts. The DAC's response on the question of internationalization and the low performance was that they did not receive any invitation as officials to attend any international function. Now, this is incredibly worrisome because they are noted for turning down applications by artists who are invited to perform at international festivals. So you ask about the appointment of Gayton McKenzie, a right-wing populist politician who seems to be gaining traction and the admiration of a large part of the arts sector. And you ask yourself, why? Are we schizophrenic? That a cultural sector that is political, that is progressive, would see a man like that as salvation. That's largely because a sector that is so hurt, so destroyed, that is struggling to find funding to sustain itself, more so after the destruction of so much of our resources during the COVID-19 lockdowns, when for almost 2.5 years the entire industry was shut down. Anyone who comes out holding some amount of cash in his hand and throwing it there is going to be seen as salvation for hungry artists. It's the politics of the stomach. Whether that would work out is dependent on what Gayton McKenzie announces in the next 2 days, where he said he's calling a press conference to announce his 10-point plan. Now, for me, what is more worrying than the state control or the state manipulation or the state's destruction of freedom of expression and freedom of creativity in the cultural sector is the decline that we have in progressive and critical writing about the arts in the media. And we can understand that due to funding constraints, that's the last point, due to funding constraints of the media, that most media are now depending on publicity copy that poses as arts journalism. The media is our last hope, but we expect you to turn publicity copy into critical arts journalism, because freedom of expression, freedom of creativity, and the health of our democracy depends on it. Thank you.
Thank you. You touched on a great deal there and a great deal of important things. So thank you very much. Quite a lot there to think about and to be concerned about. Dario, let's come to you. A lot of what's dealt with is legislative, new laws, law amendments, and how those play out in the courts. So how do you see the situation?
Thank you, Anton, and it's a great pleasure to be here. See some very familiar faces as well in the audience, so very nice to be here. I would like to focus specifically on the issue of slaps in particular, because although we don't yet have legislation on slaps, I'm going to argue that we should prioritize lobbying for such legislation. And I want to focus on three things. First, I'll talk about the South African position on slaps at the moment, where we don't have legislation, but where we really have some excellent sort of law and starting points, departure points for arguing for legislation on slaps. Secondly, I want to briefly talk about international developments and why this is really a pivotal moment to prioritize as activists and as truth tellers the importance of SLAP legislation. And thirdly, I'll end then just with concluding how I think South Africa can once again punch above its weight in this area and lead the way for the rest of the African continent, if I may say so. So firstly, in relation to where South Africa is at the moment, there was a breakthrough 2 years ago in the mineral sands case, and that was a classic sort of setup for a SLAP in the sense that you had the ingredients of what is commonly seen to be a SLAP, a large multinational, a foreign corporation, although with South African presence, suing for defamation a number of activists in South Africa who needed pro bono legal assistance, couldn't defend themselves in terms of the costs of litigation. And then we acted with our pro bono department for these activists and argued that the common law, so not legislation, we don't have legislation, but the common law should recognize an anti-SLAP defense as an abuse of process. Because at the end of the day, what SLAPs are, as the acronym suggests, strategic lawsuits, unfortunately it's an American term, which everyone's inherited, but strategic lawsuits against public participation, SLAPs. The acronym says it all. It is the attempt by powerful, whether it's a corporation or politicians or business, to stifle criticism, to stifle public participation. And so it's an abuse because it's not someone saying, I've genuinely been defamed and I want vindication. I want the world to know I'm not a thief or guilty of corruption. It's someone saying, I am using the law, I'm weaponizing the law to teach you a lesson for criticizing me and to send a message to everyone else that if you do this, I'm going to sue you. And I always use Zuma as a classic example, in my view, his litigation spree against the media, which Janet will be very familiar with, and others from many years ago, would now be characterized, I should say, as a SLAP, because there was never any intention, in my view, for him to take those matters further. It was really just to hang over the heads of the media. So where we are 2 years ago is the Concourt adopts the argument that there should be a abuse of process defense. You can argue if you sued, certainly in a defamation case, you can argue that this is a SLAP and that the motive in bringing the case was to prevent legitimate criticism, right? The next step is the Karen Morn case, which everyone knows about, Zuma weaponizing the law in the form of a private prosecution. And of course, as you know, he attempted to privately prosecute Karen Morn as well as Billy Downer, but the Karen Morn case is particularly important for the media. And so this is essentially a private citizen saying, the NPA didn't prosecute. I'm now prosecuting because you remember his convoluted argument that by disclosing a letter in his affidavit, by Karen Morn writing about that letter, which was essentially to justify seeking a postponement on health grounds. In his criminal case, she was effectively breaching a really dusty and unused provision of the National Prosecuting Authority Act. And that's a criminal offense, said Zuma, even though he was the one who put the letter in the public court record by putting it in his affidavit. And by the way, the letter didn't even disclose his medical condition. So it was really the most non-privacy of privacy points to take. In that case, Zuma's legal team argued, when Karen Morn challenged this as a SLAP, argued that the mineral sands case only applied to civil cases, and this was a criminal case. Fortunately, the KwaZulu-Natal court and the Supreme Court of Appeal on appeal said that the SLAP principle applies to criminal cases as well as civil cases. So we've got a great grounding for us to now argue that we need legislation to set the stage for detailed SLAP legislation. Because although these court cases give a weapon to litigators acting for the media, acting for activists to say, let's try and argue the SLAP defense, they're very high level. And ultimately what experience from around the world teaches us, which I'm coming to now, is that you do need detail in the rules of litigation, in legislation, to properly address the SLAP problem. So the second point I want to emphasize, and I'm not going to get into the detail of this, But around the world, there are developments at the moment where a number of countries are looking at whether anti-SLAPP legislation is needed. And as a member of the high-level panel of legal experts on media freedom, which is part of the Media Freedom Coalition, who are co-hosts here, I'm happy to see today, we're looking at the issue of SLAPPs as a real priority for the high-level panel. And you'll see the European Union has passed a directive saying member states have to pass laws to address SLAPPs. The Council of Europe has issued a recommendation on anti-SLAPP laws. The UK has a sort of a version for economic crimes that they've legislated, where you can address SLAPPs where reporting has happened in economic crimes context. Ireland has just passed or is considering an amendment to their defamation laws which will address SLAPPs. And even in the US, which is the sort of grandfather of SLAPP law, and where most states have SLAPP legislation, there are moves to create harmony amongst the states so that there's not kind of the lowest common denominator, but quite robust protection against SLAPPs in every state. So it's a pivotal moment, I think, in the last year or two for us as South Africa, and this is my final point and my third point in conclusion, to say, let's use this momentum. Let's use the fact that we've got effectively the sanction of the Constitutional Court saying there is a problem here, and we're going to try to address it in the limited way we can as a court. But let's take that learning forward, I think, and lobby for legislation. Already, the Center for Applied Legal Studies has a draft out there, a sort of model law against SLAPPs, which can be the starting point for engagement. And just as happened in the criminal defamation context, which Alan spoke about, where eventually and very belatedly and against the curve of the rest of the African continent, we finally decriminalized defamation. I think with SLAPPs we have the opportunity to say, let's lead the way in the African continent. Let's mobilize around the momentum against SLAPPs worldwide, off the back of stories like that of Daphne Galizia being assassinated in Malta, Russian oligarchs suing for defamation in the UK. And we've got our own stories here. And the last point I'd make is that in order to create the atmosphere for persuading legislatures or for advancing the common law, we need those stories. We need empirical data. And the CFE report is sort of a part of that, which is to say, for members of the media, for activists out there, you need to report to your industry bodies when you believe that a SLAPP is being perpetrated on you, because the collection of that data, in addition to then mobilizing resources around it, legal resources and others, is, I think, quite crucial. So thank you, Anton.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Patiswa, over to you.
Thank you, Anton, and thank you, panelists. For me, it's quite interesting that you said I'm not recovering from my SABC person. It is actually the case. I think for me, before I get to the other stuff, I think on the SABC matters that come off the report, I think the issue of vigilance and need for vigilance is quite crucial if you look at the happenings at the public broadcaster. Much as I'm still part of that arrangement via board, but I do think that the presence and the vigilance of civil society and the public is critical to the strengthening of that entity. Just the first one on the SABC bill, I see that in the report there are references to the head of news because the authority of decision-making in terms of the SABC bill is like to go back to the CEO, which is something that was changed in 2020 when the policies were revised. And there is a gap that was never addressed before the policies were published. But it doesn't make the other move to take back authority of editorial decision making. It doesn't make it right. But what actually happened was, once you locate editorial decision making in the office of the head of news, you leave out all other editorial decision making around entertainment and programming exposed. There's no one who accounts for that. And in fact, one of the examples is already in the report, the interview that was canned by Metro FM. It fell out of the news domain. It was done by programming. But in that case, the editorial decision-making wouldn't have been a responsibility of the head of news, because the head of news is not responsible for that. So there are areas that have been left exposed as a result of locating that authority within the news division, which is correct, but it means that there's a different mechanism that's required to cover all other areas that require editorial decision-making, because entertainment content, we've had cases where the public would be taking the SABC on matters of misrepresentation of cultural expression and all that in entertainment. But that wouldn't be the responsibility of the head of news to actually make calls on that. So that's one area that that's a gap in the policies. I'm not going to address the issue of vetting, because there's a lot of stuff that's going on there. But just a reference to what I believed to be either incompetence or the clumsiness with which the SAA has been doing vetting, because I was vetted. And it was before elections when I was vetted, even though I had submitted all the documents when I was appointed in March. In August, I got this message on Facebook. It's on Messenger. It was at 1:30, 13th August 2018. Good afternoon. And the person says, I'm working for SSA, and I would like to confirm if you are still working for SABC. Actually, I have your file to conduct your vetting. Please call me on the following numbers as soon as you get this message. That's how my vetting was coordinated, via Facebook Messenger. But this person has my file. He knows exactly where to find me, that I work for the SABC. So you have these things that are happening, much as there is real outrage around what was being done, but there is also clumsiness and all the other stuff that has been happening in how these vetting processes have been conducted. But I think on the issues that have been raised about intimidation of journalists, I think for me, freedom of expression is not just about what is happening outside media houses, by politicians, by businesses, or any other person who's trying to intimidate journalists and erode freedom of expression in media freedom. There is a danger that's sitting within newsrooms that we're not paying attention to. One, it's media owners, the interest of media owners in the content that's being produced. And in fact, it's been playing out on two stories. It's geopolitical issues, Russia and Ukraine, Gaza and Israel. And that's where you actually get to see where media interest, the interest of media owners lie in the editorial decision-making in newsrooms. So that is one part, and we need to pay attention to that, because these may be the two big stories. What else is happening locally in the coverage of different stories locally that get to be sanctioned by media owners? So that's one part. And the other part is also linked to sustainability of the media, because the pressures have meant that there are stories that the newsrooms are going to walk away from because they could jeopardize advertising and sponsorship that's coming, that should be coming if they don't cover the stories. And so those are things that in fact, media sustainability is actually coming up as a huge threat to freedom of expression and media freedom. And one other thing that also resides within newsrooms, it's journalistic independence. We talk a lot about editorial independence, which is the domain of editors in the main. But you can ask journalists and they will tell you, and actually they are going around seeking help about what they see as censorship within newsrooms. So because there's also no agency, or there is no structure in the sector that deals with issues of censorship, we only speak about it, and it will play out in some form, but no one actually gets to deal with that as an industry body. You have the two entities being the Business SA and the Press Council. They are post-fact platforms. So the public goes there to report issues on matters that have been reported already. But what about the stories that get killed within newsrooms, and that journalists end up taking instructions on what not to report on, either it's linked to economic sustainability of the media, or it's other things that have nothing to do with the newsrooms themselves. So those are things that that I do think that actually need attention. The other part is the decline of journalistic literacy in newsrooms. And this is linked to lack of due diligence in newsrooms. It's lack of duty of loyalty in the newsrooms, and the duty of care in the newsrooms. And it plays out in different spaces because you have entities that expect journalists to have huge following on social media platforms. And part of that following includes politicians and people they are supposed to report on. They become friends on social media. And how do you report on these people when you're having conversations on social media? Where's your independence when you have to interrogate the lives of these people and how they conduct themselves in the spaces where they are supposed to be serving the public? So that is one area that I've observed. But the whole thing around journalistic literacy is not about how the public understands the media. It's how the media conducts itself in telling the stories that they tell, that you have the due care, you have the questions that are being asked, you have the verification that needs to be done, and that your loyalty actually is to the citizens, not the people that you're reporting on, and including the media house that you work for. So your loyalty is to the public that you serve, or to the audiences that you serve, and not the media house that you work for. And I know that the biggest problem is job security. Journalists are scared of challenging editors on any issues that they would ordinarily try to raise, because unlike what we saw during the times of Pesel Koboza, whose life is being memorialized this week with Black Wednesday, unlike what they did at the time and they ended up in jails, the new jail is job security. No one is going to jail. People are protecting their livelihoods by walking away and overlooking things that they are supposed to be questioning. So I do think that it's something that the sector needs to pay attention to, because it's important to the continued existence of the sector. Yes, the whole issue around media sustainability is a huge problem. We may sit and talk about big tech and what it has done to erode our revenues. And while we sit and try and find solutions, as it has happened with Australia and other countries like Canada and others who are still in the process, including ourselves with the Commission of Inquiry that is just concluded, or we're still waiting for the report on that, big tech is actually ahead of us. We need to start thinking ourselves out of the problem, rather than sitting in this space and thinking, how are we going to maneuver to the extent that we get what we need? What I foresee, you have Google that may commit, as they've done in other countries, they may commit to a fund that's going to sustain the media. What we're not thinking of is, if they could give that money to the media, what stops them from setting up their own news enterprise? Down the line, instead of paying the media, they could easily end up setting their own news enterprises because they've got the money. So instead of giving that money to the media, they could end up setting up their own things. And we need to think ahead of what they could be already thinking about before we get to that point, if we are going to protect the sustainability of the media. Thank you.
Thank you. Phew. Lots to think about. Lots to think. I'm going to personally, before I open it to the floor, I'm going to pick up on one point that was raised about the vetting of SABC journalists. I think it's an important issue that we need to be thinking about and tackling. There is no good reason to vet journalists at the public broadcaster. Vetting is appropriate where one has access to state secrets. That's what vetting is for. It's, can you be trusted with state secrets? And that's a small amount of people, people like Donald Trump, who you can't trust with state secrets. You certainly couldn't trust him to be an SABC journalist. But there is no good reason to do it in the first place. Never mind the amateurishness with the way it's done over LinkedIn. The likelihood is, if it's being done, is it's being done to try and test people's loyalty, to put them on edge about their contacts and their private life. It's a very intrusive process, being subjected to those questions. And I think it's something we should tackle, and I think it's something we should encourage the SABC board to tackle on principle, to raise the question of why it's happening at all. Anyway, having said that, let's open it up to any questions or comments. Do I see an indication over there? Reggie, did you indicate? Yes. Can you give him a... Would you introduce yourself?
Thanks a lot, Anton. My name is Reggie Mwalusi. I work for SANEF. I'm just interested in your latter point, Anton, in terms of the vetting of journalists. And I suppose that's even easier with that suggestion because Patiswa is sitting there and she's a journalist herself. And she's sitting on the SABC board at the moment. So I think with what happened prior to the elections with Moshweshwe and all of that, and Patiswa understand the process. And what we know of the SABC at the moment, and new CEO trying to turn it around, but what we shouldn't underestimate is that the SABC is the biggest employer of journalists across this country. So it's an important institution. And we would like to see journalists there being independent, be free to do their work. So I just want to understand, with regard to your suggestion, what is Patiswa's view in terms of that, where the board can take that to the minister, can try to have that removed, that whether you are the executive for news or the editor-in-chief, you shouldn't be vetted.
Thank you. Patricia, do you want to respond to that?
It's a conversation that we have not had formally as the board in terms of what the next steps should be. But we have been engaging on the current issue around the vetting of the head of news. I do think that, to the point that Anton was making, that you're not dealing with any state secrets as in that role. And also, if, for instance, one were to say you need to be vetted as head of news, what stops that vetting to filter down to other editors? Because whatever that you're going to know, if let's say you had state secrets that you were dealing with, those would be known by the editors by virtue of the work that you do. So if for the moment we still don't have that filtering down to other editors, if we let it continue, because I understand that there have been attempts to vet regional editors because they are, for instance, head of news in the regions, if one were to put it that way. So it is a problem, but I do think that there is a way that it could be approached, but I do think that the assistance of civil society would be a great deal in that regard to try and address the issue, to the extent that there are more voices who are speaking on it, and it's not just left to the board, because we still have our own issues around the SABC bill itself, in the sense that it gives powers to the minister to appoint the CEO, the COO, and the CFO in the way other state entities are run, that you've got to find concurrence with the minister as the board. Otherwise, if the minister is unhappy, he may not okay that appointment. But the danger is you have a head of news that reports to the CEO. So if you have a CEO that's appointed by the minister, what is the likelihood of independence of the head of news in that arrangement? So there are layers and layers that actually need to be untangled, and which is why I'm saying we need more voices in the public space to raise the issues.
Thank you. I hear you on that. And let me just point out, because I think it needs to be pointed out, that if you're a journalist, an editor-in-chief, and you do get state secrets, your obligation as a journalist is to assess whether it's in the public interest to publish them.
Yeah.
So your professional obligation is, if it's in the public interest, to in fact expose them. And clearly it's the vetting has a chilling effect on your willingness and capacity to do that. And that's very worrying, because it affects your fundamental professional position.
Absolutely correct, because one of the process that you have to go through, which I found shocking, is that there's a point when the interview or the process is done, they are going to require access to your office without you being there. You don't know what's happening there. So, in fact, I was advised by the person who was the administrative assistant at the time. I was, because they come on site, so the whole thing is done there. And so this lady says to me, I advise you, because we never know what these people do. I advise you that if you have sensitive meetings on editorial matters, take them out of your office.
Sorry, who comes to your office?
It's, as I say, they come to your office, and you have to leave the office because they say they are debugging the office. So you don't know whether they're debugging or actually bugging the office, but that's what happens in the process. So that's how it works. So you're sitting in that office worried about the calls that you are taking, about the advice, the guidance that you are giving to journalists and the newsrooms and sources. It is a problem.
That's
and
extraordinary.
In fact, something that is underestimated as well, because no one really gets to talk about it. And it's something that we picked up. It was on the contracts of employees. Probably your employment contracts, wherever you are, have that clause that the company has a right to monitor your communication. In fact, I would be sitting and working on my desktop, and I would see the cursor moving, and you can tell that someone is reading your emails. That's how it works. And it's a clause that's in your employment contract, and by the time you raise it, it's like, but you signed that you agreed to your processes.
Can I
Go ahead.
I mean that's a really excellent point, because it's almost a standard employment contract provision for corporates to put this thing in, where they are allowed to monitor employees' email and so on. And corporates tend to use it when you get a whistleblowing report about an employee who might be breaching procurement laws or whatever, and then they monitor and so on. And all of that's legitimate in that context. But it strikes me, as you were saying, that in the media context, there needs to be quite a clear pushback to say that this is completely inappropriate for, and I'm not just talking about the public broadcaster, but any media company who is monitoring for purposes of source or serving a different agenda. I think that is problematic. And I would say on the vetting that I can't see any legal argument that justifies the vetting. And it might be something that SABC board might be empowered by a legal opinion to say, there's no basis for this. That could be used when you're having your discussions with the minister, etc.
So it was interesting that actually the process, the painful retrenchment process that the SABC went through, it enabled me to say the news division staff was not going to sign the new contracts until that clause was removed. The standard one that says you'll be monitored. And we said until that clause is removed, no one is signing the new contracts, and they had to remove it.
That's interesting. Interesting to know that you could take a stand and get it through, so that's good to hear. Any other questions or comments? I've got Karin, and then I've got you, and then I've got you. Let's, sorry, Karin first, and I'll come to you.
Thanks, Anton. Karin du Plessis, I'm a journalist for the Africa Report. Patricia, I have a question. I've listened to, I've done a few sort of courses or, had lectures on how to safeguard your communications and everything. And I would think it's easier to just bug your, or, to listen in on your phone. I mean, doesn't the SSA have more sophisticated ways than to actually go into the office and pretend to bug it? If they want to actually, listen in on your communications, it kind of worries me in a way as well, because, what are our law enforcement capacities when it comes to cybersecurity? So that's kind of the flip side of it. But yeah, it's really worrying to hear that. And then the other question, the secrecy bill, I read somewhere that there was a attempt to revive it, but I haven't actually sort of really kept up with it. Maybe, I don't know if Dario's nodding.
If I can just respond to you before coming to the next person, because we'll take a few questions. On why they would be so crude as to come to your office and pretend to debug. I think it's clear, because they want you to know they're watching you. They want to be seen to do it. If they want to discreetly listen to your calls, they have ways to do that. So it's to provoke, it's to create that chilling effect. And secondly, maybe you can add to this or correct me, but my understanding is that the secrecy bill was sent back by the president some years back. He declined to sign it, he sent it back to Parliament. So the current Parliament has now got this waiting there, and they have to do something with it. You might recall the old Official Secrets Act did need replacing, and so they have to do something. So they start with the secrecy bill as it was sent back. It does mean that it reopens all the discussions. The one they're looking at, if I remember correctly, is significantly better than the earlier versions, but it still has problems.
That's absolutely right. I mean, where it's left off is that there was some concession to a form of a public interest defense, which is the big issue, for me anyway. The idea that, as Anton was saying, it's an ethical responsibility of a journalist to publish even classified information if it is in the public interest. One thinks of, obviously, the clear examples, Nkandla, Homestead, and on the global context, the Pentagon Papers. But you could, just as Julian Assange was, be prosecuted if you do so under the current Protection of Information Act 82, which needs replacing, absolutely. The last version of the secrecy bill was far more balanced after lots of media and civil society engagement. But it only, as I recall, it said, if you reveal criminal activity through your publication, you can publish. But that's too limited a form of a public interest sort of defense. So it needs to go further. And it will be probably on the new Parliament's agenda, I'm sure, in due course. So we should all be quite vigilant to follow that.
Go ahead. Would you give her a mic?
I'm Janet Smith, and I'm a former editor and journalist and a writer, and I'm now an adjudicator at the Press Council. Dr. Mohammed, I wanted to say thank you so much. What a surprise to hear all of this important research and these thoughts around arts and culture. And where you intersected with arts and culture journalism, I think those of my colleagues in the room here who, those of us who've been around for a long time will know that I started out in arts and culture journalism. And I also wanted to commend you for mentioning Charles Blino, a very good friend of mine, an excellent journalist. There is a reason why we don't have arts and culture journalism today, and that is precisely because of that crushing of interrogation of anything around what the Department of Arts and Culture is doing, what is happening around funding. And so it's been reduced to covering celebrities and entertainment. Nothing wrong with that at all. But the actual, I guess, the investigation of what is arts and culture in South Africa, how does it happen, that journalism is dead. And it's a great, great pity. And I also commend Anton for having you on the board of the CFE, because if we don't have an interest from both areas, arts and culture, journalism and so on, and work together, because in the end we are kindred spirits, we're lost. So just to say thank you for that.
Thank you, Janet. There was no question there, but there was a useful comment. Next in line was, sorry, it's this person here and then you. It's Odwe?
Hi.
Sorry, first is, and you're next.
She's giving me. She says I must speak.
Okay, go ahead.
Hi, my name is Edward Sumelo. I'm the editor of City Life Arts. We do arts and culture there. We write arts and culture, just to let you know. But what I'm interested in the issue of sustainability, and I think it's quite important. You spoke earlier on about the big tech and why it's problematic. But I want to know, you also referred to some model that is emerging elsewhere in terms of big tech contribution to journalism. I just want to know which countries are those, and also the inquiry that you spoke about, which I suppose is just happened in this country. When is that report coming out? Thank you.
I can help with an answer there if you wish. But do you want to ask your question? Go ahead.
All right. Thank you very much for such an interesting discussion. My name is Uyanda from SOS Coalition. I am interested in asking you a question, Pasisa. I think it's very interesting what you mentioned about having the editor, having the head of news be the editor-in-chief, and the fact that it's actually going to leave editorial decisions that are within programming exposed. And I'm just keen to actually understand how those editorial decisions are currently being made where programming is concerned. Is it centralized? Is it within the video entertainment, GE? And if not, you also spoke about a mechanism. What mechanism are you proposing and putting forward? Are you suggesting that those powers are then taken back and given back to the CEO? Do you think that the CEO would be a much better person? Because I think this is something that we argue against in our analysis of the bill, and we're saying, the CEO is someone that understands the business, but they don't understand any, editorial decision making. So, I'm really keen to hear what proposal you're putting forward. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Do you want to respond to that first?
Thank you, Yanda, for that question. I think for me, okay, starting with currently, it's sitting all over the place. Video entertainment, TV is doing its own thing, radio is doing its own thing, and which is why you see we saw the canning of the interview of the Jewish survivor on Metro FM, because producers make their own decisions. There's no one who actually is there as an upward referral for that space being programming that's outside news. So you can imagine the uncoordinated way that decisions that are being made, and it doesn't help the fact that you then end up with content that necessarily doesn't serve the public broadcasting mandate of the SABC, because no one is championing that in the spaces that are outside news. But I do think that if you were to think of a mechanism that is going to address that, it wouldn't go back to the CEO still, because you still want to accommodate, not just accommodate, but address the issues of freedom of expression where artistic content is produced as part of entertainment. So you need to leave that protected still. So I wouldn't take that to the CEO, but I do think that there is a need for a centralized, a central point where producers can go and say, I have this issue that I'm dealing with. How would you provide me counsel in terms of resolving it? Currently, it doesn't exist.
That's interesting. Thank you very much. Edward, I'll give you a brief answer and can add to it if you wish, but it's too big an area to go into in great depth now. But there are countries, in Australia, the government forced Google to get into negotiations with publishers in order to pay for the use of their content. But that agreement is coming to an end, and it's basically falling apart. So it's a model that worked for, I think, 3 years, but is unlikely to continue. I mean, one of the things that happens is that these platforms take the view very often that if news is too troublesome for them, they'll just drop it. They threaten that, and they have carried it out in places like Canada, I believe, as a threat to an attempt to get them to pay for the use of that news. But it's certainly a common belief, and certainly my belief, that news is extremely important to them, and the research backs that up. So it's a threat they make and sometimes implement, but it's not one they're likely to really stick with. So there are a few countries that have made them platforms like Google pay and negotiate with publishers to pay for the use of their news. And there are places where they have set up funds. In South Africa, we have a competition commission hearing taking place, and their initial report is expected out in October, I believe. So it's due. And that will be extremely important in what it recommends as the way forward in dealing with the fact that our news is used by these global platforms without any compensation, and that it's wrecking our local news industry. They did, in private discussions with publishers, make an offer to set up a fund. They were kind of secret discussions. Everything with these platforms is secret. That's absolutely true. But the amounts they offered were rejected. They weren't serious amounts to compensate for the cost of collecting and producing that news. And there are ongoing discussions about setting up a sustainability fund, of which at least one platform has said they may contribute. I know Reggie Sarnef is involved in the discussion about setting up such a fund, and there are other discussions around that. So it's an ongoing issue and discussion, but you are right that the impact these platforms are having on our news industry is a devastating one, and it's one we need to face up and address if our local media industry is to survive. Do you want to add anything? No? I've got an indication there, yes?
Doesn't news cease to be news? As soon as it's published, it's no longer news. However, there are artistic and other professional aspects that come in together with that particular news item. So I would have said that anybody whatsoever can always repeat the news that has been published in the gist of it, but should be prevented from replaying the whole rigmarole as perhaps may be done by some institutions.
Yeah, I think broadly speaking, I think that I'd agree with that. Obviously there's the two-pronged attack against the platforms at the moment, largely in South Africa and many other countries. The one is the competition angle, insofar as the market for advertising is concerned, right? Because the idea there is that the argument is that because of their dominance, advertisers, they're able to corner the advertising market and in so doing undermine, legacy media's ability to do that. The second is copyright, insofar as you say, when you put snippets, say on Google, of my news story, sometimes that's enough for transient recipients of news to say, well, I actually know now the gist of the story. I don't have to click through and find out, the full story. And that phenomenon, I think arguably breaches copyright, where you use the snippets from the story or the headline of the story. So there are various sort of strategies to try and bring the platforms to account. And Anton says, there are kind of discussions in parallel and so on. But this competition report, which is imminent, is really going to, I think, play an incredibly important role in informing the debate going forward.
If I can just add to what you're saying, you have to see it in the context of the fact that they're scooping up all the ad revenue. So I spend a huge amount of money producing news and publishing my news. Yes, it's out there. It's out there in the open. But then a platform like Google or Facebook takes that, pays nothing, and uses it to take your revenue and make money from it without compensating you. So that you have to build into the equation to understand it's having a huge impact on our industry. How do we manage that impact in a reasonable way?
And just in addition to that, it's easy to try and deal with the issue as it stands now because we have a visible enemy and we can say so and so is using our content. What is happening with AI? You have all these AI tools that are all over the place. Everybody has come up with, we knew that it was GPT at one point. You have Gemini, you have all of them that are in place now. And they're actually using the same content that we produce as a database for whatever questions that I want to ask. And in fact, in the future, we are likely to have news media. In fact, we're starting to see it. There is what I believe to be, it's the South African, and there's another platform, and there's another one, but they literally piggyback on what has been published already. And all you need, if you were to do that, you get an AI software and you say, I want to tell a story about the state of media freedom in South Africa in 2024. You publish an article. You have not done any research. It's media content that is giving you that. And you don't know how to hold those people accountable because they are not Google, they are not Facebook, they are not the visible enemies that we know. It's someone who's lying on his back in his room, a student who's set up yeah. So how are you going to deal with that?
No, these are real problems. And Alan, I've neglected you. Do you have anything you want to add to what's been said?
No, I don't actually. I've been finding the conversation fascinating. It just shows how, as much as we try to represent what's going on in different sectors, it's so much going on. I mean, Ishmael's stories, Mario's more detailed stories, Fatiswa's examples and that. So we do our best is my feeling, but you know.
Thank you.
We always fall short, and we doomed to. Yeah.
Thank you. Juliana, introduce yourself.
Hopefully, Juliana Thornton. I do some work with Media Monitoring Africa and also with Anton. So my question is, whose job is it to have this conversation with Google and big tech around the kind of imposing regulations on them? There's obviously the advocacy role that MMA plays, that CFE plays, but it's not really in government's best interests to inject more funding and more money into independent media unless they can kind of control where that money goes, perhaps. You know, if they say, okay, well, only give the money to SABC or whatever. So how do you deal with that, and whose job is it to really push government to make those agreements and to regulate the big tech? I don't know if there's an answer, but I'm just putting it out there.
But I'll respond. I mean, the body that's taken it on in this country is the Competition Commission. And actually, that's an interesting place for it to happen because there are deep issues there about the dominance of, for example, the Google platform or of Facebook. And the dominance of them in our advertising revenues. So it is an interesting place for the discussion to happen.
And that is in fact what triggered the solutions in Australia, was also a similar competition inquiry, which then sort of in quite intrusive and in comprehensive form sets out, you know, having listened to evidence and testimony, and we saw all of that with the media companies here and Meta and Facebook, Meta and Google, but sort of the conspicuous by their absence, for example, Elon Musk's X. Once the Competition Commission has sifted through all of that, and they do that very professionally and extremely competently, you will get a very persuasive document, hopefully in the next few weeks, if not days. I don't know if there's been a delay, but certainly they did promise it in October. And that will set the stage, I think, because what the Competition Commission, for example, could do is they could recommend that legislation be passed. And that might then be taken up by Parliament. So it's a really important part of the piece in trying to hold platforms to account.
And of course, it's a fascinating time because in America, the home of Google, there is a court looking at the possibility of forcing a breakup of Google. So that decision is absolutely critical to our own media industry, interestingly, and we'll watch that closely. Our time has run out. I think I'm going to wrap up. I hope you have found this conversation as rich and interesting as I have. It has certainly illuminated need ongoing vigilance. So thank you very much to a very interesting panel. And may this discussion continue. Perhaps we should highlight that the next session today, do you want to do that?
Good morning, everyone. And I think another round of applause to the panel. What a fantastic session to kick off Media Freedom Festival. Just to highlight the rest of the sessions for the day, at 2 o'clock we'll be having a more intimate conversation, which will be taking place in the library just across the courtyard. And there we're looking at incitement online. A really heated topic, heated debate, what the sort of boundaries and parameters are when talking about incitement to violence online. It's a sort of one-on-one conversation, but we'll be tackling it from a technical perspective as well. So those of you who are more interested in the more nerdy, geeky side of things, it's the perfect conversation. And then this evening at 6 p.m., we'll be looking at building global solidarity with media freedom. And there we'll be looking at Media Freedom Coalition, the Global Media Freedom Coalition. So also said to be a really engaging and interesting discussion. So once again, thank you to the session this morning. Yes, you can please go ahead. Thank you. And we hope to see you at some of the other sessions, not only today, tomorrow and Thursday as well. You'll have access to the programs online, but please enjoy the rest of the day. There are refreshments outside, so please don't run away too quickly. All right, thank you.
Good morning. Good morning. So I've been advised that refreshments will be ready after 10 minutes, so please stay with us. We don't want you to leave without having taken something. So 10 minutes.